Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could subscribe to my lovely channel and leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from around the world. So, without further ado, let's begin the story. My name is Elias, and for 3 years, I was a third-generation groundskeeper at Oak Haven Memorial. My mentor was a man named Arthur, a guy who had spent 40 years manicuring the lawns of the dead. He was more than a boss. He was the guy who taught me that a cemetery isn't a place of fear, but a place of record. We had a rhythm. We had coffee at 500 a.m. while the mist was still sitting waist deep on the headstones, and we'd finish our rounds just as the sun dipped behind the mausoleums. It was peaceful. It was home. Looking back, though, the rot didn't start in the coffins. It started with Arthur. The initial comfort of that job was seductive. There is a specific kind of silence in a well-kept graveyard, a heavy, velvet quiet that makes you feel protected from the noise of the living world. For the first 2 years, I loved it. Arthur was a fountain of local history, pointing out the Victorian, weeping, statues and explaining the drainage systems of the older crypts. He treated the plots with a reverence that I found noble. I felt like I was part of a sacred lineage of watchers. The first red flags were so small I felt stupid for even noticing them. It started with my personal belongings. I'm a creature of habit. I always left my keys and my silver Zippo, a gift from my grandfather, on the workbench in the tool shed. One Tuesday, the Zippo was gone. I asked Arthur, and he just gave me that slow, wary smile of his, blaming my young mind for misplacing it. Then it was my work gloves. Then a small framed photo of my sister I kept in my locker. Each time Arthur was dismissive, almost paternal. The wind catches things, Elias, or you're working too hard, boy. Focus on the grass, not your pockets. By the 3rd month of that final year, the weirdness escalated. I started noticing things during the late night perimeter checks. I'd find small, hand-dug holes, not big enough for a body, just deep enough for a limb. They weren't near any active burial sites. They were always near the oldest, most crumbled section of the North Quad. One night, I heard a sound like wet leather being slapped against stone. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, and for a split second, I saw a shape ducking behind the Miller family obelisk. It was too low to the ground to be a man, but too heavy to be a coyote. When I told Arthur the next morning, he didn't even look up from his ledger. He just told me to stop imagining ghosts and get to weeding. His dismissiveness started to feel less like comfort and more like a wall. The paranoia really set in when I realized the maintenance Arthur was doing at night didn't involve any tools. I'd see his truck parked near the crematorium at 100 a.m., all the lights off. When I'd approach, he'd emerge from the shadows, smelling of copper and lye, telling me he was just checking the seals. That's when it hit me. Arthur wasn't protecting the cemetery. He was feeding it. The major discovery happened on a rainy Thursday. Arthur had gone into town for supplies, and I found his office key left in the ignition of the tractor. I shouldn't have gone in there, but the missing Zippo and the holes in the North Quad were clawing at my brain. I opened his desk, expecting to find logs or invoices. Instead, I found a leather-bound notebook. Inside weren't names of the deceased, but a meticulous feeding schedule. There were photos, too. Polaroids. My heart stopped when I saw them. They were photos of me. Not just me working, but me sleeping in the break room, me eating my lunch, and me standing over those small, hand-dug holes. But the worst part was the items pinned to the back pages: my silver Zippo, my sister's photo, and a lock of hair that looked exactly like mine. Underneath my photo, Arthur had written in his cramped, precise handwriting, "The soil rejects the old, but it craves the familiar." A willing transition is best, but a forced one will suffice. October 31st. The climax was a blur of adrenaline and pure, cold terror. I heard the gravel crunching outside. Arthur was back early. I didn't have time to hide the book. I burst out of the office just as he was stepping out of his truck. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He held a long, rusted spade in one hand, and his eyes were wider than I'd ever seen them, reflecting the gray sky. "It's a cycle, Elias," he whispered, stepping toward me. "The ground here, it's hungry. If I don't give it something of ourselves, it takes the bodies back. It brings them up." I didn't stay to argue. I ran for the gate, his heavy boots thudding on the wet grass behind me. I didn't even grab my car. I ran until I hit the main road and flagged down a passing patrol car. I told the officer everything, screaming about the book and the holes. The police did a sweep, but by the time they got to the office, the notebook was gone. Arthur was gone. They found the holes, but they were empty. Just deep, narrow shafts of dark, smelling earth. They ruled it as a workplace dispute and eccentric behavior, but I knew better. The threat isn't over. I moved 3 towns away, but I haven't slept through the night since. Last Tuesday, I walked out to my new mailbox and found something sitting on the flag. It was my silver Zippo. When I flicked it open, a small clump of damp, cemetery soil fell out. And last night, I got a text from an unknown number. No words, just a 3-second audio clip of that sound. The wet leather slapping against stone, and the faint, unmistakable sound of Arthur's voice whispering, "The soil is still waiting, Elias. And it's getting very, very hungry. I can hear something scratching at my floorboards tonight. I think he's found a way to bring the North Quad to me. Look, I don't care how it sounds to an outsider. Every family has their thing. Some families do competitive rowing. Others spend every weekend at a shooting range. The Millers, we manage the Blackwood Memorial Grounds. We've held the contract since 1924, and it's not just a job, it's a stewardship. People call us macabre, or the Goal Squad, but they don't understand the technicality of it. There is a science to maintaining a Victorian-era cemetery, especially one built on a limestone shelf that's prone to shifting. If you don't respect the rules of the soil won't respect the markers you put in it. The tradition that keeps our family bound together is the Vigil of the First Frost. It sounds like some pagan ritual, but it's actually a practical security measure. When the ground first freezes, the pressure changes in the older vaults. The expansion can crack the original mortar, and scavengers, both the 4-legged and 2-legged kind, try to take advantage of the chaos. So, every year, the cousins and I pull the overnight shift. The rules are ironclad: never walk the perimeter alone. Always carry a thermal scanner to check for heat signatures, which usually indicates a badger or a person. And if you see a vault door unlatched, you don't close it. You call for heavy support on the radio. That night, the air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass. It was my first year being trusted with a sector of my own, though my cousin Mark was supposed to be within whistle distance. I had my gear, a high-lumen tactical light, a FLIR thermal unit, and my heavy-duty brass key ring. I felt like a pro. The early encounters were standard stuff. I tracked a couple of foxes near the east gate and tightened a loose hinge on the O'Malley crypt. The FLIR showed the world in shades of cold blue and purple, with the occasional orange bloom of a small animal. It was methodical, rhythmic, and strangely peaceful. The first hint that something was wrong came around 300 a.m. I was scanning the old row, the section where the headstones are so weathered they look like rotting teeth, when my thermal scanner picked up a massive heat signature. It wasn't the small, flickering orange of a fox. This was a solid, human-shaped mass of white, hot heat, crouched behind a weeping willow. I didn't panic. I followed protocol. I clicked my radio. "Mark, I've got a squatter in Sector 4, behind the willow. I'm moving in to escort." The radio crackled, but it wasn't Mark's voice. It was just static, rhythmically broken by a sound like someone clicking their tongue. Click, click. Click, click. I figured the cold was messing with the signal. I kept my light low, as per the rules, and called out, "This is private property. Please step out with your hands visible." The figure didn't move. I raised the FLIR again, and my blood turned to ice. The heat signature wasn't just standing there anymore. It was growing. On the screen, the white, hot shape began to elongate, the limbs stretching out at impossible angles, the head tilting back until it touched the spine. Then I noticed the most terrifying detail. The figure on the FLIR was standing exactly where I had seen Mark 5 minutes ago. But it wasn't Mark. Mark was 180 pounds of muscle and flannel. This thing was a spindly, radiant nightmare. That's when the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The click-click on the radio wasn't static. It was the sound of the creature imitating the sound of my heavy brass keys hitting each other. It wasn't a squatter, it wasn't a person, and most importantly, it wasn't alone. I looked down at my thermal scanner and saw 3 more white, hot shapes emerging from the open, venting vaults behind me. They had been waiting for the first frost, not because of the mortar, but because the cold made the living stand out like beacons. The chase was a blur of terror. I dropped the FLIR and bolted toward the north gate. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I didn't care about heavy support. I could hear them behind me. Not the sound of boots on gravel, but the sound of something heavy and wet dragging itself through the frost-covered grass. Sh-clack. Sh-clack. I dived behind the mausoleum of the Sterling family, my chest heaving, the air burning my lungs. I pulled out my whistle and blew it until my throat felt like it was bleeding. I saw a flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Elias, is that you?" It was my Uncle Dave. I ran toward him, nearly knocking him over. I was hysterical, babbling about the heat signatures and the stretching limbs. He looked at me with a grim, knowing expression that scared me more than the monsters. He didn't ask what I saw. He just grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the main office. The aftermath was a wall of silence. My family didn't call the police. They didn't even act surprised. They just spent the next day welding the old vault doors shut, not with ornamental iron, but with heavy steel plates. My Uncle Dave told me I had overactive senses, and that the gas from the old graves causes hallucinations in the cold. But I saw the way he looked at the ground. I saw the way my cousins wouldn't meet my eyes. They know. The vigil isn't about security. It's about checking the locks on a cage. I quit the family business the next week. I moved to the city, as far from the smell of damp earth as I could get. But the mystery isn't unresolved for me. I know they're still there. 3 days ago, I woke up to find my apartment door unlocked. I live on the 4th floor, and I'm a fanatic about my deadbolts. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw something that made me drop my coffee. Someone had left a gift on my counter. It was my FLIR thermal scanner, the one I dropped in the cemetery months ago. The screen was cracked, but when I turned it on, it still worked. There was a single saved image in the gallery. It was a thermal shot of me, sleeping in my bed, taken from the corner of my ceiling. And in the corner of the frame, right next to my head, was a white, hot, spindly hand, its fingers clicking against my nightstand. Underneath the scanner was a small, frost-covered stone from the Blackwood Old Row. Scratched into the surface was a single word, Mumenter. I'll be honest, I didn't take the job because I'm some kind of goth or a fan of the macabre. I took it because my student loans were a predatory weight on my chest and my car's transmission was screaming its final rites. When a private estate management firm posted a listing for a night relocation specialist, at the St. Jude's Hinterland Annex. I didn't ask what was being relocated. The pay was 4 times the minimum wage, and the only requirement was discretion and physical stamina. St. Jude's isn't one of those parks, like cemeteries with fountains and joggers. It's an American Gothic nightmare tucked into a valley in the Appalachian foothills, where the humidity clings to the headstones like a wet shroud. My partner for the shift was a guy named Marcus. He was older, cynical, and had the kind of jittery energy that comes from drinking too much black coffee and living in a trailer. He needed the money for a custody battle. We were 2 desperate men standing in a field of the forgotten. Just don't look at the names, Marcus told me as we pulled the equipment out of the back of the rusted flatbed. The firm wants these plots moved to the new memorial park before the county floods the valley for the reservoir. We dig, we crate, we move. Don't make it personal. The annex was suffocatingly beautiful in a decaying way. The iron gates were choked with dead ivy, and the monuments, mostly from the 1800s, were carved with heavy, lidded angels and weeping willow motifs. The air smelled of wet slate and something sweet like rotting peaches. On the first day, the atmosphere was just heavy. It felt like the oxygen was thinner inside the stone walls. The tension started on the 3rd night. It began with the tools. I'd set my spade down, turn to grab a crate, and find the spade 10 feet away, standing upright in the soft mud. Marcus and I started bickering. "Stop messing around, Elias," he'd snap, his voice tight. "We're behind schedule." I'd tell him I wasn't doing anything, and he'd just scoff, his eyes darting to the tree line. We were isolated, no cell service, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive over a mountain pass. It was just us, the crickets, and the rows of silent stone. Then there were the lights. I'm not talking about ghosts. I'm talking about logic, defying bioluminescence. We were working on a particularly deep vault belonging to a family named Vance when I saw a flicker of pale neon green pulsing from inside the cracks of the stone. "Marcus, look," I whispered. He didn't even turn around. He just kept shoveling, his movements frantic. "It's marsh gas, kid. Phosphorus from the remains. Just keep digging." But marsh gas doesn't pulse in time with your own heartbeat. The escalation was violent. On Thursday, we arrived at the site to find our flatbed truck had been vandalized. Not by graffiti, but by something physical. The heavy steel of the hood had been peeled back like a sardine can, and sitting on the driver's seat was my wallet, the one I'd left in the locked glove box. Inside, my cash was gone, replaced by a handful of human teeth, small and yellowed. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "Marcus, look at the truck. Something is out here. We can't leave." Marcus hissed, and for the first time, I saw true terror in his eyes. "If we don't finish the Vance plot, the firm won't pay." "I can't lose my kid, Elias!" That's when the message appeared. We had a portable whiteboard for marking plot coordinates. When I turned my headlamp toward it, the coordinates had been wiped clean. In their place, written in a dark, viscous sludge that smelled of the deep earth, were the words "exngirint oni y." The climax happened an hour later. We were winching the Vance matriarch's lead-lined casket out of the earth when the winch snapped. But it didn't just break. The steel cable was sheared through. The casket slammed back into the pit, and from the darkness of the hole, a sound emerged. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, rattling sigh, like 1,000 lungs breathing at once. "Run!" I yelled. I didn't wait for Marcus. I bolted for the gates, tripping over roots that felt like fingers grabbing at my ankles. I heard Marcus screaming behind me, not for help, but screaming at something, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury and fear. I didn't look back until I reached the main road. I flagged down a state trooper 2 miles away. When I told him there was a man in trouble at St. Jude's annex, he looked at me with a blank, stony expression. He didn't turn on his sirens. He didn't even call it in. "There's no work order for St. Jude's," he said calmly. "That land was condemned in the 60s. Nobody goes in there." When I insisted, he drove me back to the gate. The flatbed was gone. The crates were gone. The Vance plot was perfectly filled in, the grass looking as though it hadn't been touched in decades. There was no sign of Marcus. I went to the management firm's office the next day. The address on the original listing. It was an empty storefront in a strip mall. I called the number, and a man with a voice as dry as parchment answered. "Mr. Elias," he said, "we received your resignation. Your final payment has been processed. Where is Marcus?" I demanded. "What did you do with the Vance plot?" "There is no Marcus on our payroll," the voice replied. "And St. Jude's? Well, some places are better left on the map than visited. Don't call again." I checked my bank account. There was $50,000 in it, exactly the amount I needed for my loans and a new car. But every time I close my eyes, I smell those rotting peaches. And this morning, I found a smear of that same dark sludge on my apartment door handle. The reservoir is being filled next month. They're going to drown that valley. And I can't help but wonder, if Marcus was the old one, exchanged for the many, what happens when the water rises and the many have nowhere left to sleep? I should have known better than to think a gift from my Uncle Silas would come without strings attached. Silas was the black sheep of the family, a man who lived in a crumbling Victorian cottage on the edge of the Blackwood Memorial Park, spending his days as a freelance restorer of 18th century funerary art, when he passed away from natural causes. Although the coroner's report mentioned a heart stopped by sheer, blunt, forced terror, he left the house and his entire inventory to me. I was a freelance graphic designer living in a studio apartment. The prospect of a mortgage-free house overrode the fact that my backyard was literally a sea of headstones. I'll skip the boring stuff about the probate and the cleaning. The signs were all there from the first afternoon I stepped into his workshop. The air didn't just smell like dust, it smelled like ozone and wet iron. Scattered across his workbench were strange materials, vials of grave wax, brushes made of human hair, and a series of charcoal rubbings from the oldest, most weathered markers in the cemetery. Among his belongings, I found a heavy, rusted iron key labeled simply, "The Bastion." The first manifestations were easy to dismiss. I'd be working on my laptop in the kitchen and hear a rhythmic clink, clink, clink coming from the workshop. When I'd check, a hammer or a chisel would be vibrating on the table, as if a heavy truck were passing by outside, except the cottage was at the end of a dead and dirt road. Then there were the footsteps. Soft, dragging sounds on the porch that would stop the moment I reached for the door handle. I told myself it was just the house settling or the wind whistling through the iron filigree of the cemetery gates. If only I had listened to the local tavern owner, a man named Miller, who turned pale when I told him where I was living. Silas wasn't just fixing stones, he'd whispered. He was holding them down. Driven by a growing sense of unease, I began a research phase into my family's true involvement with Blackwood. I found a hidden compartment in Silas's desk containing a ledger dating back to the 1840s. It turned out the men in my family hadn't been restorers. They were anchorites. According to the ledger, certain graves in Blackwood weren't built to honor the dead, but to act as seals for things that had been pulled out of the earth during the coal mining booms. My uncle's job was to recarve the wards, to physically etch specific geometric patterns into the stone to keep the residents from wandering. The activity escalated until it was undeniable. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom floor covered in 6 inches of freezing, black water that smelled of the deep earth. When I turned on the light, the water vanished instantly, but the floorboards remained bone, dry and covered in the muddy prints of three-fingered hands. My cat disappeared that same night, only for me to find her collar draped over a headstone in the bastion section, the very area my uncle had been obsessively restoring before he died. The dread of inherited responsibility became a physical weight. I realized that since Silas's death, the carvings on the bastion stones had begun to heal. The deep grooves he'd spent years etching were smoothing over, as if the stone were scar tissue. In a desperate attempt to stop what was started, I took Silas's tools and the grave walks out to the bastion at midnight. I tried to follow the rubbings, to re-carve the lines that held the silence in place. But I'm not a stonemason. I'm a man who stares at screens. My hand slipped, the chisel bit too deep, cracking the central marker, a heavy, nameless slab of black granite. The sound wasn't the crack of stone. It was the sound of a seal breaking. A low, sub-harmonic hum began to vibrate through the soles of my boots, and the ground beneath me felt soft, like a sponge soaked in oil. That's when it hit me. The inheritance wasn't the house or the money. It was the debt. I'm still in the house. I can't leave. Every time I try to drive past the cemetery gates, my engine stalls, and I'm overcome by a lethargy so thick I find myself walking back to the cottage in a trance. The permanent consequences are visible every morning in the mirror. My skin is taking on a gray, stony cast, and my fingernails have become hard and brittle, like flint. The curse is ongoing, and it can't be undone. Last night, I heard a voice coming from the drain in the bathroom. A dry, rattling sound that called me by my middle name, a name only Silas knew. It told me that the bastion is hungry for a new anchor. This morning, I found a new rubbing on my workbench that I didn't make. It's a rubbing of a headstone that doesn't exist yet. It has my birth date on it, but the date of death is left blank, waiting for the stone to finish healing over. I have the chisel in my hand now. I have to keep carving. If I stop, the things under the bastion will come up to help me. And I've seen the way they carve flesh. I should have walked away when I saw the hazardous environment clause in the contract. But when you're 3 months behind on rent and your bank account is a graveyard of insufficient funds, notices, you tend to gloss over the fine print. The job was for a position at Greater Metropolitan Mortuary Services, specifically their Recovery and Transition wing. It wasn't in a flashy downtown office. It was a concrete bunker of a building located on the far edge of the Pine Barrens, bordering a cemetery that hadn't seen a new headstone since the 1950s. The money wasn't worth it. I know that now. But at the time, the $15,000 signing bonus felt like a lifeline. My first day was deceptively corporate. I met my supervisor, a man named Henderson, who wore a suit that looked like it was made of lead, heavy, gray, and perfectly still. He introduced me to the 2 other members of my team, Sarah and Miller. We were transition technicians. The procedure was simple. We were tasked with the recontainment of older plots that had suffered from soil liquefaction. That's the term they used. It sounded like a geological fluke. I spent the morning learning how to operate a specialized, pressurized hydraulic pump and a series of heavy, lead-lined containment canisters. They made it clear that we were never to open the canisters once they were sealed. That was the first, strange protocol. There were others. We had to wear gauger counters. Even though there was no radioactive material on site, we were forbidden from speaking while inside the restricted zone, a section of the cemetery known as the Hollow. And most strangely, we had to carry small, silver bells on our belts for vibration monitoring, Henderson said with a straight face. The first week, Sarah pulled me aside near the vending machine. She looked like she hadn't slept since the Nixon administration. If your bell rings when there's no wind, She whispered, her eyes darting toward the security camera. "You don't look down. You just keep pumping. And if Miller tells you he heard a voice from the canisters, you tell Henderson immediately." That's how the last guy, well, he didn't quit. He just transitioned. I dismissed it as workplace hazing until the following Tuesday. We were working in the hollow, a low-lying area of the graveyard where the fog never seemed to lift. I was manning the pump, watching the dark, viscous slurry move through the transparent reinforced hose into a canister. It was supposed to be mud and decomposed organic matter. But as I watched, I saw something solid pass through the tube. It wasn't a bone. It was a hand, pale, perfectly preserved, and it was clutching the inside of the hose. I froze. My bell began to chime, a frantic, tiny silver scream. "Don't look down." "Elias!" Miller hissed, his voice cracking the silence of the restricted zone. But I couldn't help it. I looked at the canister. The lead-lined walls were denting from the inside. Something was hitting the metal with the force of a sledgehammer. And the sound wasn't a thud. It was a wet, rhythmic pulsing, like a giant heart beating in the mud. The truth came out that night when I found Henderson's discarded logbook in the transition bay. Greater Metropolitan wasn't a mortuary service. They were a disposal contractor for something the government had found in the 50s. The cemetery wasn't a place of rest. It was a filtration system. The bodies were being used as sponges to soak up a sentient, biological byproduct of some failed experiment, and our job was to harvest the saturated remains and replace them with fresh units. That's when it hit me. We weren't just recovery specialists. We were the next crop. I tried to quit the next morning. Henderson sat me down and slid my contract across the table. He pointed to a clause I'd missed. Employee agrees to biological integration as required by the transition process. "You've been breathing the air in the hollow for a week, Elias," Henderson said, his voice devoid of any human inflection. "The transition has already started. If you leave now, without the suppressants we put in the break room coffee, the process will accelerate. You'll be slurry by sunset." I was trapped. For the next month, I was forced to participate in the harvest. I watched as they replaced Miller after his bell wouldn't stop ringing. I watched them lower him into a fresh trench, still screaming, while Sarah and I were forced to man the pumps to seal him in. The professional obligation to survive overrode every ounce of my morality. I finally escaped during a catastrophic containment breach. On a moonless Friday, something massive, something made of 1,000 transitioned parts, pushed its way out of the slurry pits. In the chaos I ran. I didn't take the suppressants. I stole a truck and drove until the sun came up, waiting for my body to dissolve. I didn't die, but I am forever changed. The transition didn't turn me into mud, but it marked me. My sweat now smells like that sweet, rotting peach scent of the annex. My skin has a translucent, gelatinous quality in the moonlight. But the worst part is the sound. I can't go near a cemetery anymore. Not because I'm afraid of ghosts, but because I can hear them. Not their voices, but the pumping. I can hear the rhythmic, hydraulic thrumming of Greater Metropolitan's machines beneath the earth, no matter where I am. Last night, I woke up and found a silver bell sitting on my pillow. It wasn't there when I went to sleep. I picked it up, and even though the air in my room was perfectly still, the bell began to ring. Somewhere out there, Henderson is checking his harvest log, and he's realized he's one unit short. I'll skip the boring stuff about why I needed to disappear. Let's just say when you're a freelance archivist with a history of burning bridges, a 6-month contract to catalog the library of the Blackwood Estate, located dead center in the oldest private cemetery in New England, sounds like a godsend. The terms were simple. I stayed in the caretaker's cottage, I didn't leave the grounds, and I worked alone. The isolation was the point. No phones, no internet, just me and 10,000 volumes of funerary records. Looking back, though, the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. For the first month, I had a false sense of safety. I developed a routine that felt manageable, even cozy. I'd wake up at dawn, walk the perimeter of the iron fence, and spend 10 hours in the library. The cemetery was beautiful in a bleak way. Rows of weathered slate markers that looked like jagged teeth rising from the frost. I felt productive. I felt in control. I remember writing in my first journal entry, "The solitude is a tonic." For the first time in years, the noise in my head has stopped. The subtle changes began in the second month. It started with time distortion. I'd sit down for a quick lunch at noon, and when I looked up, the sun would be gone, and my watch would say it was 900 p.m. Then there were the objects. I'm a meticulous man. I keep my fountain pens parallel to the edge of the desk. One morning, I found them arranged in a perfect circle. I blamed it on sleepwalking. The stress of the job manifest as a quirk of the subconscious. Then came the mental doubt phase. My journal started to betray me. I'd flip back a few pages to check a date, and I'd find entire paragraphs written in my handwriting that I had no memory of composing. Entries like, "The gate doesn't keep them out. It keeps the soil from spreading," or "He is counting the steps from the crypt to the porch." I began to question my sanity. I stood in front of the mirror and whispered my name until it sounded like a foreign word. Was I breaking, or was the house breaking me? The outside confirmation came on a Tuesday. I had convinced myself that the tapping on the window was just a frozen branch. But that morning, I found a handprint on the outside of the second-story library glass. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long, with too many knuckles, and the skin had left behind a residue of black, oily grave mold. I didn't imagine that. I couldn't have sleepwalked onto a ladder that didn't exist. The breaking point happened during a blizzard that cut off the last of the light. I was huddled by the fireplace when the library door, which I had bolted and braced with a heavy chair, creaked open. Not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing, deliberate motion. I held my breath, waiting for a monster to jump out. Instead, I saw a version of myself standing in the doorway. He was wearing my clothes, but his skin was the color of wet slate, and his eyes were just empty, moss-filled sockets. He didn't attack. He just sat down at the desk and began to write in my journal. I collapsed. The psychological weight of seeing my own physical form being reclaimed by the cemetery atmosphere was too much. I remember screaming, throwing a heavy inkwell at the thing, and then running blindly into the snow. I didn't care about the contract. I didn't care about the rules. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed ice, eventually collapsing at the main gate. I was found by a local sheriff the next morning, half buried in a drift. They treated me for hypothermia and acute cabin fever. The doctors told me that isolation can do strange things to a man's perception. They said the handprint was probably a bird's strike, and the journals were just evidence of a dissociative episode. But the isolation never truly ended. I live in a crowded city now, in an apartment overlooking a busy intersection. But the time distortion is getting worse. I'll be standing in line at a grocery store, and suddenly the lights will flicker, and for a second, the floor tiles are replaced by damp, clumpy earth. I'll look at the person in front of me, and their face will momentarily turn into the moss-eaten mask of the thing I saw in the library. Yesterday, I found a new entry in my current notebook. I haven't used that notebook in weeks. The handwriting is mine, but the ink is that same black, oily mold. It says, "The catalog is almost finished, Elias. You left your shadow behind in the soil. It's lonely. It's coming to collect the rest of the book." I can hear the tapping on my window now. I'm on the 12th floor. There are no branches here. I'll skip the boring stuff about my time as a night shift security guard for the municipal district. It was a paycheck, or at least that's what I told myself until the night of the subsidence event at Blackwood Heights. At 2:14 a.m., the ground didn't just settle, it inhaled. I was patrolling the older, south-facing slope of the cemetery when a section of the earth, roughly the size of a suburban swimming pool, simply vanished into a sinkhole. I shouldn't have looked down, but my flashlight beam caught the bottom of the pit before the dust settled. It wasn't just dirt and broken coffins down there. There were structures, modern reinforced concrete rooms built directly beneath the Victorian graves. And there was something moving in the strobe of my light, things in white hazmat suits, dragging heavy, black bags away from the debris. The official response was terrifyingly fast. I hadn't even keyed my radio when 3 black SUVs screamed up the gravel path, their lights cutting through the fog. Men in dark, sterile uniforms, no insignias, just high, gloss badges that caught the moonlight, pushed me back. They were overly calm, their voices modulated and rehearsed. "Step back, Officer Miller," one of them said, his hand resting on a high and encrypted radio. "It's a localized gas pocket. Highly toxic. You're experiencing hypoxia." The gaslighting phase began before I even left the site. By the time I was debriefed at the precinct 2 hours later, the sergeant looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He showed me the digital log. My report of a structural collapse and unauthorized personnel had been rewritten as reported sighting of a stray animal. Officer confirmed no incident. They told me I'd had a panic attack due to exhaustion. Looking back, though, the precision of their lies was the first real clue. I tried to find the photos I'd snapped on my phone, but the gallery was empty. Not just the photos of the pit. My entire cloud backup had been wiped clean, replaced by a sync error message. When I went back to the cemetery the next afternoon, the sinkhole was gone. Not filled with fresh dirt, but covered by a perfectly manicured, weathered patch of grass and headstones that looked like they had been sitting there for a century. They had swapped the entire landscape in 12 hours. The paranoia set in, and I began digging into the archives. I found a hidden patterns. Over the last 20 years, 14 guards had been retired for medical reasons, following shifts at Blackwood. In the basement of the city library, I found an old microfiche of a 1994 newspaper that hadn't been digitized. There was a small blurb about underground maintenance at the cemetery, funded by a shell company called Vesper Hollow Logistics. That's when it hit me. The cemetery wasn't a place for the dead. It was a roof for something else. I was cornered in the break room by the district director, a man named Sterling whose smile never reached his cold, gray eyes. He didn't yell. He leaned in close, smelling of peppermint and ozone. "You have a very imaginative mind, Elias," he whispered, "but the city doesn't pay for imagination. It pays for silence. If you keep looking for rooms that don't exist, we might have to find you a permanent residence in a place where the soil is very, very thick. Do you understand?" I tried to expose the truth. I reached out to a journalist friend, but when we met at a diner, he showed me his phone. Every email I'd sent him had been replaced with gibberish code. My bank account was frozen for investigative audit. Every time I turned a corner, a black SUV was idling, its windows opaque, the low hum of its engine vibrating in my teeth. The ongoing surveillance has become my entire life. I quit the force, but I didn't get away. I see the maintenance crews everywhere. At the grocery store, sitting in the park, always wearing those same high, gloss badges. They don't hide. They want me to know they're watching. Last night, I found an envelope slid under my door. It was a formal, heavy stock letter with the city seal. It was a case closed. Notice regarding the stray animal incident from my final shift. But when I held the paper up to the light, I could see the watermarks. They weren't seals of the city. They were the geometric patterns of the concrete rooms I'd seen in the pit. And attached to the back of the notice was a single Polaroid photo. It was a shot of me, taken from inside the sinkhole, looking down into the dark. In the photo, my flashlight is illuminating a hand reaching up from the black bags, a hand with my own unique birthmark on the wrist. The case is closed, but I can feel the weight of the permanent residence Sterling promised. Every time I step onto a patch of grass, I feel the earth shiver, as if someone underneath is checking the structural integrity of the ceiling. Let's just say that when you're a freelance historian specializing in forgotten architectures, you don't settle for the bus tours where they hand out plastic beads and hurricane cocktails. I wanted the marrow of the place. That's how I found Julian. He wasn't on the flashy pamphlets. He was a specialist liaison for the St. Cyril Necropolis, a sprawling, private city of the dead that was strictly off limits to the public due to structural instability. Julian was the picture of competence. He met me at the rusted iron gates wearing a crisp linen suit, carrying a heavy leather-bound manual of the cemetery's original 18th century plots. He had the credentials, a PhD in anthropology, and a key ring that looked like it belonged to a medieval jailer. He spoke with a rhythmic, comforting cadence about the evolution of the sarcophagus and the chemical properties of the local soil. I felt like I was in the hands of a master. "The rules are simple, Elias," he told me, handing me a heavy-duty maglite and a laminated map. "Stay on the gravel, keep your radio on channel 4, and never ever step inside a family vault without me. The stone is treacherous." Looking back, though, the protection he offered was actually a fence. The first minor deviations occurred about an hour into the tour. Julian, who had been so adamant about the gravel-only rule, suddenly stepped off the path and waded knee-deep into the overgrown fern beds surrounding the Leclerc mausoleum. "The map is a bit dated," he muttered, not looking back. "The soil has migrated. We have to take the soft route." I followed, my boots sinking into the spongy, black earth that smelled of ancient rot and wet copper. It felt wrong, but he was the expert. I trusted the manual in his hand. Then came the quiet manipulation. He started feeding me facts that contradicted everything I knew about St. Cyril. He told me the vaults weren't built above ground because of the water table, but because the residents needed to be closer to the air. He began to subtly lead me deeper into the labyrinth of tombs, his pace quickening. Whenever I tried to check my own GPS, he'd dismissively point to the manual, claiming the iron in the gates created a localized magnetic interference. I was becoming entirely dependent on his voice. The moment of doubt hit me like a physical chill when we reached the center of the necropolis, a sunken rotunda of crumbling crypts. Julian stopped in front of a nameless, soot-stained vault and whispered, "This is where your grandfather wanted to be, wasn't it?" I froze. I hadn't told Julian about my family history. I hadn't told anyone that my interest in St. Cyril was fueled by a rumor that a disgraced branch of my lineage was buried here. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice cracking in the heavy, humid air. Julian didn't turn around. He just ran his hand over the stone, and I noticed for the first time that his fingers were unnaturally long, the skin stretched so tight over the knuckles it looked like parchment. "The ground keeps a ledger, Elias. I just read the entries. Your grandfather didn't die in a fire. He was called back to the maintenance crew. Just like you." The revelation was a hammer blow. Julian wasn't a guide, he was a harvester. He wasn't serving the historical society or the city. He was serving the hunger of the St. Cyril soil. The manual he carried wasn't a map of the graves, it was a guest list. The confrontation happened too fast for me to process. He turned toward me, and his eyes weren't the warm brown I'd seen at the gate. They were the color of stagnant water, reflecting a hunger that was centuries old. The structures aren't unstable because of age, he hissed, stepping toward me with an impossible, fluid grace. They're unstable because they're moving. They're trying to find fresh anchors. He reached for my throat, his hand smelling of the deep, airless dark. I didn't think. I swung the heavy maglite with everything I had. It connected with his temple with a sickening, wet thud, the sound of a spade hitting mud. He didn't fall, he just stumbled, a black, viscous fluid leaking from the wound. I didn't stay to see if he'd get up. I ran. I ignored the map, ignored the gravel, and sprinted toward the distant glow of the streetlights, my lungs burning with the stench of the dead. I burst through the gates and didn't stop until I reached the French Quarter. I told the police, but when they went to the St. Cyril office, they found it empty. No Julian, no Lenin's suit, just a pile of rusted keys and a manual that turned out to be filled with blank, soil-stained pages. The aftermath is a nightmare of hyper-vigilance. I left New Orleans that night, but I can't escape the feeling that the tour is still ongoing. Yesterday, I was scrolling through a travel forum for a trip to the Pacific Northwest. An ad popped up in the sidebar. It featured a photo of a man in a crisp Lenin suit, standing in front of an old pioneer cemetery in Oregon. He was holding a leather-bound book and smiling that same practiced, comforting smile. The caption read, "Uncover your family's deepest secrets with Julian. Your expert guide to the forgotten. Limited slots available for the winter solstice tour. We've been waiting for you." I looked closer at the photo. Behind the man, carved into the stone of a nearby headstone, was my own name. It was a janitorial position, but my only real responsibility was the midnight grooming. My predecessor, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment, handed me the list of tasks with a casual shrug, as if he were explaining how to change a light bulb. "Every night at 12:01, he had said, "you take the silver basin to the north weeping willow. You pour the water over the roots, you wipe the dew from the Miller family obelisk, and you whisper, 'The house is quiet. The bed is made.' Simple as that. Don't overthink it, Elias, it's just tradition." The routine setup was easy to internalize. For the first few weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. There was a rhythm to the work, the clinking of the basin, the soft friction of the cloth against cold granite, the repetition of the phrase, "The house is quiet, the bed is made." It felt like a secular prayer, a way to honor the dead. The instructions were passed down so casually that I didn't question why the water in the silver basin always felt heavy, or why the Miller obelisk was always covered in a thick, viscous dew, even during the driest summer nights. Looking back, though, the normalization was the trap. The subtle symbolism started to bleed into my consciousness. I noticed that the dew I was wiping away wasn't water, it was a pale, translucent film that smelled faintly of iron. And the timing, 12:01 a.m., wasn't just for convenience. It was the precise moment the day died. I found myself performing gestures I hadn't been taught, a three-finger tap on the base of the stones, a specific way of tilting my head to listen to the wind through the willow. It felt like my body was being programmed by the repetition. "The house is quiet, the bed is made." I caught myself saying it at the grocery store, under my breath, while reaching for a carton of milk. Pattern recognition set in during the autumn equinox. I realized that the cleaning routine changed slightly based on the lunar cycle. On the new moon, I had to wipe the stones twice. On the full moon, I had to pour the water in a spiral. I did a bit of digging in the local archives and found that the Miller family didn't exist in the town records. There were no Millers buried at Oak Haven. There was, however, a record of a Muller family from the 1600s, a lineage associated with a cult of the earth. that believed the ground needed to be soothed to prevent it from rising. The hidden purpose revealed itself on a Tuesday night. I had forgotten my cloth and had to return to the shed. When I walked back to the obelisk, I saw what the routine was actually doing. The dew wasn't a byproduct, it was a lure. And the phrase, "the house is quiet, the bed is made," wasn't a comfort to the dead. It was a lie told to something underneath. As I watched, the ground at the base of the stone began to churn, not like an earthquake, but like a mouth chewing. A pale, sightless thing, the size of a man's torso, breached the soil to drink the water I had poured. It wasn't a ghost. It was a parasite of the earth, and my routine was keeping it docile, keeping it fed so it wouldn't wander into the town. The dread of being a feeder for a monster broke me. I attempted to stop the process. The next night, I stayed in the shed. I didn't take the basin. I didn't say the words. I sat in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the silence to win. The retaliation was immediate. The ground beneath the shed began to vibrate with a low, sub-harmonic growl. The air grew cold, and the smell of wet copper became suffocating. Suddenly, the walls of the shed were pelted with something. Hundreds of small, hard objects. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside, the Miller obelisk was gone. It hadn't been moved, it had been pulled under. In its place was a jagged hole, and my silver basin was sitting at the edge, crumpled like a tin can. I ran. I didn't go back for my paycheck, and I didn't call the police. How do you report a hungry hole in the ground? The ongoing cycle, however, doesn't care about my fear. I moved to a different county, but the rhythm follows me. Last night, I drove past a small, nondescript cemetery on the outskirts of my new town. It was 12:01 a.m. I slowed down, my breath hitching in my throat. There, under the light of a pale moon, I saw two people, strangers, wearing the same gray janitorial jumpsuits I used to wear. One was carrying a silver basin. The other was meticulously wiping the dew from a nameless headstone. They moved with a synchronized mechanical grace, their lips moving in unison. I couldn't hear them from the road, but I knew exactly what they were saying. The house is quiet, the bed is made. As I watched, the stranger with the basin looked up. They didn't have eyes, just smooth, pale skin where their sockets should have been. They smiled at me, a wide, empty grin, and gestured to the empty space beside them. The routine is continuing. The earth is being soothed, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I still have the three-finger tap in my muscle memory. My hand was already tapping the dashboard. We were that couple, the ones who spent our weekends photographing Victorian funerary art and exploring the overgrown garden cemeteries of the Northeast. It was our shared language. Sarah was a restorer, a woman who could tell the difference between Italian marble and local granite just by the way it held the morning heat. We lived in a small cottage on the edge of the Evergreen Memorial Park, and for 5 years, it was a life of quiet, shadowed bliss. Looking back, though, the change didn't happen with a scream. It happened with a sigh. The personality shifts were so subtle I felt like a monster for even noticing them. It started after she returned from a solo weekend trip to a remote, neglected burial ground in the Catskills. She came home smelling of damp slate and ozone, her eyes a fraction darker than I remembered. She was still Sarah. She knew our jokes. She knew our history, but her laughter had lost its jagged edge. She was smoother, polished. When I mentioned our plan to visit the Highgate in London next year, she just smiled and said, "Why go so far? The earth here is finally starting to taste right." The physical inconsistencies were what kept me awake at night. Sarah had a small, crescent-shaped scar on her left thumb from a slipped chisel back in grad school. One morning, while she was pouring coffee, I noticed her thumb was perfect. The skin was seamless, marble smooth. When I grabbed her hand to look closer, She didn't flinch. She just tilted her head and asked why I was acting so brittle. Then there was her handwriting. Sarah's script was a chaotic sprawl of cursive. Now she was leaving notes on the fridge in a cramped, precise hand that looked like it had been etched with a needle. I tried to talk to our friends, but the social gaslighting was relentless. She's just matured, Elias, my brother told me. She's finally over that anxiety. You should be happy she's so grounded. They didn't see the way she sat in the dark for hours, not reading, not sleeping, just staring at the cemetery fence with a terrifying, rhythmic stillness. The proof phase came when I found her old phone in the back of the junk drawer. I looked at a video we'd taken a month before her trip, a silly clip of her laughing at a crooked headstone. I played it back, then looked at the woman sitting across the room from me. The real Sarah had a slight lisp when she was tired. This woman spoke with a voice like sliding gravel. I checked her current phone. Every photo of us from the last 3 years had been deleted, replaced by hundreds of close-up shots of the soil in Evergreen Memorial. Just dirt, layer after layer of dark, wet earth. I'll skip the part where I lost my mind and go straight to the confrontation. I waited until the moon was high and she was standing by the bedroom window, watching the mist roll over the graves. "Where is she?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Where is the woman who has a scar on her thumb?" She didn't turn around. Her reflection in the glass didn't move, even as her body shifted. "Sarah was tired, Elias," the voice said, a sound that vibrated in my marrow. She was so full of holes, so much grief, so much air. The soil doesn't like air. It likes density. It likes things that stay where they are put. "What are you?" I choked out. "I am the repair," she said, finally turning. Her face was Sarah's, but the skin was tight, almost translucent, like a thin layer of wax over stone. "I am the weight that keeps the plot from shifting." She's not gone. She's just distributed. She's part of the foundation now. She's very quiet. She's finally resting. That's when it hit me. There was no ritual, no struggle. The cemetery hadn't taken her. It had simply filled the space she occupied until there was no room left for her soul. The loss was absolute. I realized the woman I loved was 1,000 miles of topsoil now, her memories nothing more than data used by this thing to keep me calm. But the Sarah entity didn't leave. She stayed. She cooked dinner. She folded the laundry. She integrated perfectly. Our neighbors think we're the perfect couple. They see us walking through the graveyard at dusk, hand in hand, and they think it's romantic. They don't see that her grip is so strong, it's slowly crushing the bones in my hand. I'm living with a statue that wears my wife's skin. And the horror of intimacy is the worst part. The way she kisses me with lips that are always exactly the temperature of the ground outside. But the real threat is what I found this morning. I woke up and looked in the mirror. My left eye, the one Sarah always said was her favorite, looked different. The iris was a fraction darker, and when I touched my cheek, the skin felt cold. Not the cold of a draft, but the deep, heavy cold of a vault. I looked down at my desk and saw a note I'd written to myself. I don't remember writing it, but it was in that same cramped, precise needle script. "The house is almost quiet, Elias. The bed is almost made. You're starting to feel much more solid, aren't you? I can feel my pulse slowing down. I can feel the air leaving me. I'm next." The cemetery is tired of looking at me through the window. It wants to see the world through my eyes. And as I look out at the rows of headstones, I find myself wondering, how many of the people walking their dogs out there are already made of stone?